Coordinator here at the Archives, and I'm so excited to see you here in the Farley Auditorium and to all of you joining us online on our YouTube and Facebook platforms. Before we begin, I only have just two brief announcements. The first is that the Museum of Alabama on the second floor is still closed, but we are getting oh so close to the time where I get to announce that it is reopened. So we're getting there, we're so close, but it's still closed for now. But remember that the Archives building is still open, especially the first floor. Our research room is still open Tuesday through Saturday, and we do have some temporary exhibits on our first floor in the hallway and in the Milo B. Howard Auditorium. So you can still come to the Archives, and very soon you can go up to the second floor again. And I'm so excited for that. All right, I also want to announce that next month, our Food for Thought series will continue as Warren Rogers will present Reconstruction Showdown, the battle for the University of Alabama, 1869 to 1871. Now, if you are one of the people who say roll tide, you might like that. If you're a War Eagle person, you can still learn something, all right? So I hope to see you all again, and that's going to be next month. Food for Thought 2025 is sponsored by the Friends of the Alabama Archives and only made possible through a grant from the Alabama Humanities Alliance. So thank you to both the Friends and AHA for helping fund programming here at the Archives. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Carol Byerly. Carol Byerly specializes in the history of military medicine. She taught American history and the history of medicine at the University of Colorado Boulder and was a contract historian for the U.S. Army Office and the Surgeon General. She has also worked for the U.S. Congress and the American Red Cross. In addition to her Gorgas biography, Byerly has written on the influenza pandemic of 1918 in the U.S. Army, the history of tuberculosis in the Army, and the medical challenges during the construction of the Panama Canal. And her book, Mosquito Warrior, is available in our museum store. I should also mention that if you come to the Archives, the museum store is also open. That's another thing you can come do while the second floor is closed. But her book is available for purchase, so I encourage you to go grab it afterwards. She has very nicely signed all of the copies, but if you want a personal message, I'm sure she would also be willing to do that for you. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Byerly.
Thank you. Whoa, that's loud. Is it too loud? Okay, we'll be okay. Thank you for inviting me to this series and to this beautiful auditorium. I love these old buildings and this beautiful auditorium. And I'm glad to be in Alabama because William Gorgas was a son of Alabama. He was born in Mobile. He went to school in Greensboro. His family lived in Briarfield. So is this conflicting or is this working for everybody? It's working? Okay. His family lived in Briarfield. His father was the president of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa briefly, and his mother became the librarian there, and the family lived in Tuscaloosa for more than 50 years. And he was, as you may know, the grandson of an Alabama governor and member of Congress, John Gale, and his father, Josiah Gorgas, was a general in the Confederate Army. So Gorgas is a son of Alabama, and that's why I'm happy to be here. As Alex said, my field is military medicine, and I first became interested in William Gorgas when I was doing research on influenza in the Army during World War I. And I went down to the archives in Tuscaloosa, and this is my book that I produced, Fever of War on the Influenza in the Army during World War I. And I found his diaries. He has diaries and journals in the archives in Tuscaloosa. And I learned during World War I, he wrote these diaries to his wife, Marie. And I thought that was so interesting. He's on a ship going to Europe and he's writing to Marie about this. And there was an intimacy to these diaries that intrigued me. So I became interested in Gorgas because he had a good marriage. And then I also became interested because it looked like from these diaries he had been fired. And I wondered, none of the biographies mentioned that he'd been fired, but I wondered why the Army would get rid of its Surgeon General in the middle of an epidemic, in the middle of a war. And so I was further intrigued. But as I said, there are only two biographies of William Gorgas at the time. One was written by his wife, Marie, after he died, and she didn't like to talk about negative things. She made him much of a hero. And then John Gibson wrote, these are the only two biographies. There's the one by Marie on the left, and then John Gibson generally used Marie's story to tell his biography. One's in 1924, one's in 1950. No one had written about Gorgas at the time I was looking, which interested me. And it was not for lack of documentation. There were thousands of documents. The Gorgas family saved its materials. And so you don't have to read all this, but the University of Alabama had 8,000 documents. The Library of Congress had 12,000 documents, Gorgas papers. The National Archives had boxes and boxes of documents during his 40 years as a medical officer in the Army. And the University of Virginia has a very extensive archive on the discovery of the mosquito as a vector of yellow fever in 1900. So it's not for lack of documentation. So I was intrigued and I thought maybe one day I'll write this biography, and I finally did. But today I'm not going to just give you the straight biography of this interesting man. I want to rather talk to you about how the archival record revealed William Gorgas to me. Because I love working in the archives. It's so much fun. I'm not happy if I don't have those white gloves on, and I'm working through old papers and get a little dusty and sneeze a little bit. That's my idea of a good time. So that's kind of how we're going to proceed through Gorgas's life. Glimpses of Gorgas. We don't have to wait for him to write. We see glimpses of William Gorgas in his father's letters and his diaries. And so Josiah Gorgas, again, a very famous Confederate general, kept a diary every day, and he talked about his children and their childhood illnesses and their education. And so you see Gorgas there. One of my stories that I like is he talks about Willie is such a hyperactive kid that at church he fell off his pew. And so you see glimpses like that. And then he also wrote to his wife, Amelia. He traveled a lot as an Army officer, and he and Amelia were well educated and very literate. And so they wrote a lot. And so he would write to Amelia and they would discuss their children. And in those letters, both have been edited by Sarah Wilford Wiggins, who has since died, but those are available. So I was able to get to Gorgas before he could write. But I did get to read, I discovered in the archives the first letter he ever wrote. And that was to his father when he was 11. And in that book, in 1865, and in that book, he told his father about his gun that he had, and he assured him that he had rebel sympathies. So, and he was a horrible speller. He was a bad speller. It upset Josiah, but that is something he never overcame. Gorgas always had trouble with spelling throughout his life. When William Gorgas went to medical school, oh, there he is. How could I not include that picture? That cute little baby. So there he is. When William Gorgas went to medical school, he continued the same practice as his father of keeping journals and writing to his mother. And so that's when I started having a record of him. And he kept a journal of all his expenses. And so there we learn that while he was in medical school, he bought newspapers, Democratic newspapers. He was a Southerner. He bought fruit, a lot of fruit. He liked fruit to supplement his boarding house diet. He made offerings to his church, and he smoked cigars. And this is something that he continued. Of course, he was very happy when he was in Havana, and he had people sending him Havana cigars when he was Surgeon General. But I see that early as he's a young man in his journals, how much he's spending on these things. So see, we're just moving right through his life. So if he goes to medical school and he wants to be in the Army, but he can't go straight through West Point because the president would not approve the son of a Confederate general to go to West Point in the 1870s. And so he became a doctor first, and then he went in as a medical officer. And he served in the forts on the frontier of the United States in the 80s and the 90s. And each of these forts kept a record of the medical operations. And so when a new medical officer would come, they would continue writing in this fort. So I just had to figure out where Gorgas was in what year and get those journals and see what kind of medical practice he had. What did he do? So I am ahead of myself. Okay, I got ahead of myself. So let me back up. He's still an Army officer and he's still in a fort, but he's at Fort Brown in 1882. And that is, we know that William Gorgas got yellow fever as a young medical officer, and that made him become immune. And that was why he could take care of patients with yellow fever throughout his life, because he was immune. He got it in 1882, Fort Brown. Lee and I went there together to see Fort Brown, and that is where he met his wife. But how happy I was when I found this letter. I found the telegraph that advised that Gorgas had yellow fever, and then I found this letter from him telling the Surgeon General that he had taken sick with yellow fever. That's in the archives. So he became sick, but he was caring for this young woman named Marie Doty. And Marie just about died, but he was her doctor, and she survived, and they recovered from yellow fever together, and they fell in love. And I have his letters to Marie, some of his love letters. And he wrote to Marie, they had a long courtship. They were a little shy. But I've got these letters, and his first admission of love is from his dog. And he says, "I know Duro wishes you his best love." He always had dogs, so he expressed his love through his dog first. And he would buy her apples, and he would buy her fruit, and I have a record of a ring that he bought her. But unfortunately, we don't have Marie's letters to him. And I don't have much correspondence from Marie in the archives. And I don't know why. It's either that he couldn't save them because he was moving around so much, or she may have destroyed them herself when she was going through them. But we don't have the record, so I have the one side of the romance and the marriage, but not the other side very much. So now I'll get back to where I was. I was getting so excited about the forts that I forgot the romance, which is like something I really wanted to talk about. And Marie talks about it at length in her own biography. So they got married and began their life on the frontier. And so Gorgas was an Army officer, medical officer on the frontier for about 16 years. And he treated the Army personnel, and he treated all the people around each of the forts. They were kind of a public health operation, including Lakota Indians when he was up in the Dakotas. And then we come back to the logs. So each fort had a log of what these medical officers did and what treatments they gave. And this was a general practice. William Gorgas lanced boils, he removed tumors, he set broken bones, he treated scrapes and cuts of people thrown from horses, thrown from wagons. He fixed a laborer, I like this one, who struck himself with an axe on the right temple. He delivered babies. He treated people with measles, mumps, tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, whooping cough, syphilis, alcoholism, and hemorrhoids. This is a general practice. And he was also called to other forts when there was a yellow fever epidemic. And because he was immune and he was known, so it was safe for him to treat patients with yellow fever. So he would travel to other forts to do so. He also cared for, there he is as a captain. He also cared for his wife and his daughter, Eileen, and that's in these records as well, when they got sick. And his wife was never healthy after her yellow fever bout. It can damage your organs. And so she was always having health problems, but she survived him, out-survived, obviously, if she wrote his biography. But this is a photograph that I really like. I couldn't put it in the book because it wasn't really developed very well, but here we have Gorgas, and he's always smiling. He was a happy man. He's always smiling. There's Marie, always worried, a little severe, and there is a black nanny whose name I don't know. Look at those tight waists, they're wearing corsets. And then he always had a horse. He loved his horses. He named him Traveler several times after Robert E. Lee's horse. And there's Eileen, the daughter there, and then there's the dog. So this is the family portrait of William Gorgas on the Western Front. With the nanny there, I should say, I was always alert to Gorgas's views on race. His mother, Amelia, had come from a slaveholding family, and she was an unreconstructed Confederate to her death in 1913. But her son was more moderate. And in his letters, we do not see hateful language. And he cared for, throughout his career, all patients, regardless of race. And so we see this. And of course, when he's Surgeon General of the Army, he has 4 million patients to take care of, and they come from all backgrounds. So William Gorgas was more moderate, certainly more moderate than his mother, Amelia. Questions? I think I'm going along here, and if you just stop me if you have questions. The quiet life on the isolated forts ended with the Spanish-American War in 1898. And William Gorgas was sent to yellow fever country because he was immune. So the Surgeon General knew his immunity and said, okay, I'm going to send you into yellow fever country. And then we start getting a huge archival record because we're with the government, we're in a war, and we have many more records. But there are two sources that were of particular interest to me as I was doing my research. One was Gorgas's personal journals that he kept on yellow fever cases. He worked at, this is the camp in Siboney in Cuba, where they set up a special yellow fever camp to care for the patients. And he worked at that camp for a number of months. And so he kept journals. And when I was at the Library of Congress, which is a wonderful archive, they brought me these journals, and they were in cellophane. And they'd been wrapped in cellophane, and no one had ever used them before. So I got to open the cellophane and reveal these journals. And they were very profound to me. because here he kept records of each of these patients, mostly young men, and their backgrounds, their age, 18, 31, 34, and then whether they lived or died, discharged. So I saw these journals, and there are two of them, two leather-bound journals that he kept his whole life. And I thought, this experience changed the man. He was traumatized by this because yellow fever had a mortality rate of like 30 or 40%. He lost a lot of his patients, and it was an ugly disease. And it was a high fever, but also the virus attacked your liver, and you would vomit blood. It was called black vomit, vomito negro. And so it was and you could die in a few days. And so these journals, I decided, were very important, and I would make them part of my story of William Gorgas. So we had these that informed his experience in Cuba. And then we also had his letters to Marie. And his letters to Marie were very powerful because he described his experience in dealing with these sick patients and his lack of resources and how tired he was and how there was little water. I mean, they had hundreds of patients and 4 or 5 doctors and not enough nurses. And this is one patient. Now, I'll tell you, this picture is used for just about every epidemic in the history of the United States. If you see this picture on another documentary, but this is really from Siboney, and this is really yellow fever. It's not cholera, it's not influenza. This is a yellow fever patient. But I wrote to his wife several times a week. Here's a letter from Siboney, Cuba, and he's writing to her briefly, but he's hot, he's worried, and he is going to stay in that camp until he himself gets typhoid. And then he has to be evacuated out because he gets typhoid and he loses 40 pounds. So my thing is disease and war. And disease is devastating during wars. And we don't think about it often, but this was a very large factor. 8 times as many men died of disease during the Spanish-American War than in battle. Generally typhoid and yellow fever, little malaria too. So after the war, William Gorgas was assigned to Havana because Havana was a hotbed of yellow fever. And they said, we want you to care for the soldiers and help clear it up from yellow fever. And so this is where the famous story of Walter Reed discovering that the mosquito was the vector of yellow fever takes place. So here's Yellow Jack. It's called Yellow Jack because if a ship was sailing and it had yellow fever on board, it would put a yellow flag on top. And then people would know to stay away. But this is the Reed Commission. There's handsome Walter Reed. And then these are the members of the commission. And they discovered through some very elegant experiments and proved that the Aedes aegypti mosquito transmits yellow fever. But then William Gorgas in Havana took anti-mosquito measures and actually cleared Havana of yellow fever. And he led the team that did so. And that happened within months. And it was amazing. Walter Reed couldn't believe it. And neither could Gorgas, that they could just, if you get rid of mosquitoes, you get rid of yellow fever. And this was considered a triumph of modern medicine. But it also soon became a triumph of American medicine, a triumph of the Reed Commission. And but as I learned it, it was more complicated than that. It was more complicated. And when they made it the Reed Commission, they eliminated Gorgas from the story. So I have a bad guy. I have Jefferson Randolph King, Jefferson Randolph Keene was a friend of Walter Reed's. Walter Reed, after his discovery, died tragically of appendicitis in 1902. Died quickly at the age of 50. And so a lot of the glory for conquering yellow fever fell to William Gorgas. And Jefferson Randolph Keene was jealous. He didn't like that. And so he started eliminating and dismissing Gorgas from the story. And you say, really, Carol, aren't you exaggerating? And I say, no, this is an important part of the forgotten aspect of William Gorgas. So I'm going to explain my theory with two pictures. This is a Cuban artist in 1900. And now this is the star of the show. This is the biggest mosquito you've ever seen. But here's Walter Reed and Jesse Lazare of the Reed Commission. But here also is Carlos Finlay, who's the Cuban who theorized the mosquito. Juan Gutierrez, who is a Cuban doctor, and William Gorgas, is a friend of both of these guys. Well, they don't appear in the Reed Commission story, but here they are in this drawing from 1900. But Jefferson Randolph Keene lives until 1950, and he spends the next 50 years making sure that Reed gets credit for all of this. Why? How do you say? So, before World War II, the Army, there's a commission for a Conquerors of Yellow Fever portrait, and Jefferson Keene advises the artist. He advises the artist, and he portrays the conquest of yellow fever in this way. Here are these two members of the commission inoculating one with a mosquito that had yellow fever in her to feed her. They thought she was going to die, so they fed her on somebody's blood, and that guy got yellow fever, so that proved that it inoculated. And then all of these, these Americans, and then here's Walter Reed, and here's Jefferson Randolph Keene. He was still in the hospital at this time. He'd gotten yellow fever. He was still in the hospital. Walter Reed wasn't even in Cuba when this inoculation happened. The actual inoculation happened with just these two guys alone in a laboratory where they were trying to grow the mosquitoes. But Keene portrayed this heroic picture, and he said Gorgas isn't in it because Gorgas didn't believe in the mosquito theory. Well, nobody believed in the mosquito theory at this time because that's why they were doing the experiment. It's really unfair, but this is what he said, and he said it several times in correspondence. So what? This picture becomes the iconic image of the conquest of yellow fever. It hung in the Walter Reed Army Hospital for several decades. I found it in a military medicine textbook. You find it all over. So this becomes the story, and William Gorgas is nowhere to be found. So this is one of the arguments in my book. Another problem is that in the 1930s, Philip Hench, who's a Nobel laureate, a brilliant scientist, takes on the discovery of the mosquito vector in Cuba as a hobby. And he starts collecting material. And he wants to find as much material as he can about this whole exciting experiment. Guess who advises him? Jefferson Randolph Keene. And so you go to this archive, and Keene has written all of these notes on these documents saying, well, Gorgas wasn't really involved in this. I mean, and he promotes what he wants to, and this documentation that Hench collected in this archive in the University of Virginia is the biggest archive of these experiments. How big? The index is 96 pages long. And Gorgas is not really that evident in this documentation because of Keene's efforts. This is another example. This is the Hench collection in 1948 malaria conference. Walter Reed and Ronald Ross, who was an English scientist. Where's Gorgas? I do not see Gorgas. Walter Reed didn't do anything about malaria. Malaria wasn't a problem in Havana. William Gorgas worked on malaria in Panama. And so that takes us to Panama. But if anybody goes to the Hench Museum, to the Hench collection, they're gonna see Reed as the hero, which he is, but also others, Cuban doctors, William Gorgas. But before I go to Panama, I have to have a picture of mosquitoes. You can't tell this story without mosquitoes. So the mosquitoes, it takes different mosquitoes for different diseases. So this is the bad lady. And you know that mosquitoes are the most dangerous animal in the world. They kill more people than any other animal in the world. And this is the yellow fever mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito, and this is the Anopheles mosquito who transmits malaria. But they also transmit Zika and West Nile fever and chikungunya, dengue fever. They are very dangerous. And I got a mosquito on the front of my book because that's what it's all about. He's a mosquito warrior. Gorgas understood how to stop yellow fever, and so he said, let me do it in Panama. Yellow fever had thrown the French off their efforts, and so the Americans said, we're gonna try, but not if people go down there and die of yellow fever. They were having trouble. So William Gorgas said, let me go. Once you get to Panama, you again get a huge archival record. There's another famous story, which if you've read David McCullough's book, The Path Between the Seas, he tells the story about when Gorgas goes to Panama, the commission doesn't believe that mosquitoes carry disease. They think it's a crazy idea. And so Gorgas isn't given the resources or the staff to fight mosquitoes the way he wants to, or he needs to. And so people are dying on his watch, and he's being blamed for it. And so again, I found very rich documentation of this this period in Gorgas's life. And when I was teaching, one of my lectures was the worst year in William Gorgas's life. And this is the log of yellow fever cases in Panama, in Ancon Hospital in Panama, where, in fact, they screened in their apartments where they lived in Panama, and he would sit on the veranda and smoke cigars, and he could see the morgue from there. And so he'd have reveries about the meaning of life because he was losing patients all the time. But this is a log of the yellow fever patients. And in this year, 1905, I also discovered something else. This was the year that Marie Gorgas was discovered to have breast cancer. And she underwent a double mastectomy and radiation therapy when it was just being used. And so, so Panama is a death trap. There's bad headlines all over the place. Gorgas is losing patients, and his wife is fighting cancer, which was considered a death sentence in 1905, as you can imagine. You can't imagine how stressed he was, but he kept his head. He wanted to quit and stay with Marie during her last months of life, and she said, no, you belong in Panama. She sent him back, and we've got that correspondence. We've got him telling his brother, I want to be with her, but she says, I need to be here. And so his life is in the balance. And then I'm in the archives, and I see documentation of this. I find this is the letter from the doctor, and this is the lab report on her surgery. So here we have, and I had a doctor help me with this, read this stuff, but early cancerous invasion of her tissue. And so I found the actual medical report that's in Gorgas's records. And also his logs are of great interest to me because here he is talking about Marie and her situation. And then here he says he's chief sanitary officer of Panama Canal, meaning he still has a job. And bill introduced to do away with the commission in Congress. So he's dealing with his job and with this international crisis, and his wife is fighting for her life. It ends happily. Teddy Roosevelt becomes convinced of the mosquito theory, and he gives Gorgas the go-ahead. Gorgas defeats yellow fever, and the Americans are able to build the canal, which is an amazing phenomenon. And Marie recovers to outlive her husband. But that was a big year, 1905. How am I doing time-wise? I don't have a clock.
12:37.
Okay, I'm doing fine. Okay, good. And see where we are. So he is rewarded for his work in Panama by being named Army Surgeon General by President Woodrow Wilson. And here we come to a different archival problem. So many archives, cubic feet of archives. The record of the Army Medical Department during World War I is 23,000 cubic feet. So what's a historian to do? You do the best you can, and you try to be smart and just access the relevant documents, but we also had records of congressional testimony. There were numerous hearings. Every week, Gorgas was going to Congress and testifying. And again, his letters, we have his letters, writing to his wife, to his family while he's working in Congress. This was a hugely stressful time, again, because when Gorgas first became Army Surgeon General, there were 443 medical officers for an army of 175,000, less than 200,000. By the end of the war, there were 30,000 medical officers and 4 million men in the army. Just think of that growth and overseeing that growth. Historians, though, gloss over this picture. They don't really focus on Gorgas because he's been kind of sidelined in history. But my research, and I argue in my book, is that he was an effective leader during this time. And he was a good manager because he didn't have a huge ego, and he delegated, and he let other people take over their expertise. But I also learned that he had trouble. He had trouble because he had trouble with the chain of command. And he had trouble with the generals, and he had trouble with the Secretary of War. And that's for 3 reasons, basically. Number one, he's always trying to get more resources, more hospitals, more nurses, more doctors to care for the soldiers. And this is taking away funds from the fighting part of the Army. Number 2, he and his doctors advocated preventive measures such as quarantines when there were epidemics in the training camps, and this slowed down mobilization. And this was the kind of thing that the military commanders objected to and did not want. And number 3, Gorgas went around them finally. In one particular bill, he wanted to increase the rank for the Army officers. He didn't think they got enough respect in the Army because they didn't have a high enough rank. And the British and the French medical officers had higher rank, and so he put a bill through Congress to have higher rank. The Secretary of Defense, Newton Baker, and they didn't like this. They didn't want to spend the money. And so Gorgas went around to Woodrow Wilson and got the bill signed. So they were mad. General Pershing was mad. And so I have the letters to Marie where he sent to do a tour of the inspection tour of the troops in France, and he thinks he might be fired. Well, guess what? He was fired. And I told the story. He was fired because he went around the line command and they said, we can't really work with you anymore. So that's an argument I make. But he did look good in his uniform. And when his daughter got married, she cut the wedding cake with his saber. That was in Panama. So after the war, Gorgas started traveling. Gorgas started traveling overseas as early as 1903 to advise on yellow fever and fight yellow fever. So I got to make this map, which is harder than it looks. This was hard to make a map. But you can see he's going to Europe and he's going to Egypt, he's going overseas, and then he has numerous trips around Latin America to inspect and advise and fight yellow fever. And Marie goes with him on a lot of these trips. So after World War I, he's retired. He was working with the Rockefeller Foundation. He was going to go to fight yellow fever in West Africa. But he was getting older. The hard travel, he had malaria, so he would have bouts of malaria back and forth. He was getting older, and it was wearing him out. This is on their way to London in 1920, and he looks pretty sick there, if you ask me. But they went to London. I went to London with a friend, and we went to the hotel where he stayed. And they're in London on their way to Africa, and he has a stroke. And he dies on July 3rd, 1920, with Marie at his side. But the archives, again, brought me all kinds of insights. Before he died, for example, King George V wanted to knight Gorgas for his work on yellow fever, for his work during World War I. But Gorgas was too sick to go to the palace to be knighted. And so George V came to the hospital. And so I have Marie's letter to Gorgas's brother describing when the king came to the hospital and gave Gorgas this medal. So that was this, and now the medal resides in the National Library of Medicine. So I got to look at the medal, the archives. And so Marie's letters to her family, because he lingered in the hospital for three weeks and worked with a British doctors, and they cared for him. So we're in the hospital with him, and we went to, it was in the old Tate Museum where he stayed. The archives also revealed a poem by a woman, May Thomas, and I opened my book with this poem. And she attended his London funeral. The king allowed for him to have a funeral in London equal to that of a 3-star general. So he got the Coldstream Guards. Those are the guys with the bearskin hats, and he got the steed, the riderless steed. And May Thomas went to the funeral and afterwards wrote a poem to Marie about it. And I opened my book with that poem. And here he is. These are clippings from the Gorgas family. They did clippings. They started clippings when he was in Cuba. And so there's these scrapbooks of clippings that you can see things that other people haven't saved. Here he is going down. My friend and I walked the trail of the funeral procession too. And finally, in the archives, we have, Gorgas was also honored with the funeral in Washington, D.C., and he was buried in Arlington Cemetery with the Secretary of War, who had fired him, honoring him. And we have Gorgas's brother, Richard, writing to his sisters, describing the funeral. And so very intimate views. And so in conclusion, people ask me if I feel funny reading other people's mail. Love letters, stories of pain, stories of suffering. And I say no, because William Gorgas and his family saved their letters. They saved them for posterity. They saved news clippings and photographs for a reason. We don't know what that reason is, but perhaps they wanted to be remembered. Perhaps they wanted to be understood. And so as a historian, I was grateful and am grateful that that they saved these records and I was able to sit with these records. And because of Gorgas's closeness to his family and his closeness to his wife, Marie, I could see some of his inner life. And through that, we can maybe better understand an earlier world. So thank you. So questions? Please.
Are online. I will say you can put a question in the comments. It'll come to my phone and I can ask it on your behalf. But we have one right here.
Can you give us some specifics on how the warrior mosquitoes actually kill the mosquitoes?
Okay, happy to. It's different for yellow fever and malaria because they're different kind of mosquitoes. So yellow fever mosquitoes are very domestic. They live in houses and they like calm water. And so in Havana, what you would do is you would fumigate the houses. And so they would paper over the windows with newspapers and they would fumigate. And then you would cover up all the water sources because mosquitoes breed in water. And Cubans, like a lot of people, save their water in cisterns. And so they would go inspect them and look for wigglers, which are the little larvae, and they would cover up these places. There's a good story that one of the things the nurses did in the hospitals is ants would bother patients in the tropics, and so the nurses would put little cups of water in the hospital legs of the beds, and they would look at the water in these hospital beds, and they were just, thriving with these mosquito larvae. And so you eliminate water sources, you kill the adults, and then you screen, and then you inspect. So Aedes aegypti, yellow fever mosquitoes are a lot easier than malarial mosquitoes. Malarial mosquitoes live in swamps. And they live in swamps and they have a reservoir. They can live in deer and they transmit the disease to the deer and they bite the deer and then they can transmit it. So it's harder to do that. So but they learned. So my argument about Gorgas is Panama became a center of research about mosquitoes. And they had a laboratory and they were doing things like they would have a mosquito, they would weigh a mosquito, and then have them bite somebody and then weigh them again to see how much the blood that they weighed. And they would dissect them to find out what was going on inside them. They learned a lot. One of my favorite ones is they took, Joseph Prince was Gorgas's mosquito research guy, took a bunch of mosquitoes and they dyed them blue. And then they released them. They had traps, all these different and they learned that mosquitoes can't fly farther. They don't want to fly farther than 200 yards because they get dried out. They don't like the sun. They get dried out. So what do? You mow the lawn. And so if you see these the buildings, the camps, you mow the lawn for 200 yards around all these buildings, and the mosquitoes don't want to fly there. So you mow the lawn, you use screens, and then you oil over canals and things, and look for water sources. So, but with malaria, see, I can go on and on about this. So I'm just about done, but malaria, there's also a prophylactic, and that's quinine. And so you can, quinine will treat malaria, won't cure it, but it'll treat it, but also is a preventive. And so in Panama, the workers were required to drink quinine every day, which they didn't like. But that's why you get gin and tonics in the military army, because you put a little gin in with the quinine and then it's good. So they did the research, and Gorgas, he knew his mosquitoes. He wasn't a scientist per se, but he was the administrator and he loved good ideas and he supported it. So thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yes.
When does DDT come in?
World War II. That's World War II, and the Army figured that out. The Army, Douglas MacArthur had to stop the war in the Pacific because malaria these islands in the Pacific that were so malarial that he had in one unit 100% rate of malaria. And so we developed what was called malariologists. And they developed DDT during the war. And so then then the argument was that you get the DDT on the island before you invade, because then your soldiers don't get sick. So, military entomology is probably really interesting too.
We had another one. Oh, and if I
Yeah.
bring this, just if we don't have a microphone, our online audience hears nothing, and then an answer to a question they don't know.
Earlier during the Spanish-American period, you had the journal up of various patients. They were all Hispanic names. Were they in the Army or were they civilians?
They were Spanish soldiers. They could be Spanish soldiers, they could be Cuban soldiers. So the Spanish-American War, you had a lot of Spanish. And then after the war, Spanish civilians came over to work in Cuba. And so there were a lot of Hispanic names, but they were Spanish because it was a Spanish colony. And that was the idea. The United States was liberating Cuba from Spanish control. And the story of the Spaniards occupying Cuba and how they because the Cubans were revolting against Spanish control. And so that's what started the war. And then the Americans came in. There's an argument that one of the reasons Americans came into the war was to prevent yellow fever from coming to the United States. Because yellow fever was not endemic to the United States. We didn't have, the mosquitoes didn't live in the United States. They would come during the summer through trade. And so Gorgas's thing was eliminate the sources of yellow fever and then you protect the United States. And that led to occupation of some of these, American occupation of some of these Latin American cities and countries.
We had a question online about if Gorgas's campaigns experienced pushback from skeptics, and how did he handle that? And is it kind of a similar kind of skepticism that we see today?
Yeah, good question. There was, Gorgas believed in education. And so what he would do is he personally went around in Havana and looked at houses and explained, we have to see, get rid of mosquitoes so you don't get sick. So he believed in education and he believed in being nice. And he believed in being nice, and he didn't want Americans being mean to these people. And it was more a process of good politics diplomacy. And so his wife tells a story of he'd go around and people would open the door and they say, "There's no mosquitoes here, Dr. Gorgas." And they shut the door. They knew. So it was education, good humor. There was a fine. So you could be fined for having wigglers in your house. But The fines were rarely induced, that it was there, but they were not imposed. They were excused. So he was a very positive public education guy. Public health, military medicine is public health. Yes, there was skepticism, but there's a difference. There's some gruesome pictures of smallpox vaccinations because when we went into World War I, not everybody had smallpox vaccinations, but the Army would vaccinate you. And smallpox vaccinations, I think we all have the scars, right? You get a scar from vaccination. And so some of these guys got scars, and there's always been an anti-vaccination campaign. And I found those files in the archives. But Gorgas was cocky about his science. And all of the medical officers said, we're right, you're wrong. And they were supported up the line. And so there was this real positive sense of modern medicine. And it was cocky to some degree. But this was the dawn. They were eliminating one disease after another. And so it must have been fun. The Army discovered and instituted the typhoid vaccination. The typhoid vaccination, as I said, killed 8 times as many people as combat did in Spanish-American War. World War I, 8 cases in the entire Army. Why? Typhoid vaccination. Typhoid vaccination, it was experimented on in troops, 1909, 1910, and then it became required of all recruits. And so that eliminated typhoid from the Army. And then DDT eliminated typhus in World War II. And typhus has been, anyway, because that's lice-borne. So, see, I get on a roll on these diseases.
How did the native people survive?
Excellent question. Yeah, so immunity, because in these yellow fever communities, everybody might get it, but they are immune. So you get it when you're a child. And so the Cubans didn't have a sense of urgency about yellow fever because they didn't have epidemics. You get epidemics when you get new populations, naive populations coming in, like Americans or Spanish soldiers. The Spanish soldiers coming over from Spain, because yellow fever is not endemic in Spain. But the Cubans would say, well, they had already had it as babies, or they had their mother's protection. So it's immunity. It's amazing how powerful this immunity thing is. These are great questions.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Byerly again for a wonderful presentation. And thank you to everyone who has joined us. I hope to see you again next month on September 18th when Warren Rogers talks about the University of Alabama and Reconstruction. So see y'all then.